Hello, I am Elif Kevser Özer, a PhD student at Boğaziçi University, which has been resisting for academic freedom for more than 2 years. First, I would like to thank my esteemed professors, Eva Hlade and Savas Chilenis, for inviting me to give this talk today. I will present stories of Greek citizens who were deported from Turkey in 1964-1965. Through these stories, I hope to humanize the narrative of Apelasis'i, which in the existing literature is mostly discussed from the perspective of international relations. Let me start my presentation. I conducted field research for a total of 5 months in 3 different periods between 2020 and 2023. I conducted my first 2 field research in Athens and the last one in Thessaloniki. I conducted deep interviews with 80 people. Only one of my interviews was deported. Unfortunately, I didn't have the chance to interview with the deported people due to the pandemic. 20% of my interviewees were people whose parents were deported. The rest were people who had deported family members or witnessed the period. As a result of this research, I have created an audiovisual archive of approximately 250 gigabytes. And in this presentation, I will not include the names of my interviewers. And when I do use names, I will use pseudonyms. First of all, I would like to briefly mention the developments that paved the way for the deportation of the Istanbul Greeks. It should be taken into consideration that Greek citizens had already been deported before 1964. The accusation of malicious activity and espionage in 1964 was not the first time that the Greeks of Istanbul were accused. Philomenos, for example, who photographed the destruction caused by the Septembriana and communicated this to the foreign press through a colleague, was deported in late 1957 on charges of harmful activities against Turkey. Also in 1958, members of the Dionysius Association, which was founded in the 1930s by Greek citizens of Istanbul, were first detained for a long time and then deported on charges of aiding Cyprus. According to Anna Theodoridis' study of the Somatyon Elinon Ipikon Apelotendon ek Türkias, the Association of the Exiled, because 51 deportations took place between 1957 and 1963. 6 deportations in 57, 12 in 58, 13 from 60 to 62, and 20 in 63. However, I would also like to draw attention to the fact that in the early 60s, the issue of population exchange was being discussed on the agenda of Turkey for various reasons. Again, when we look at the newspapers and parliamentary minutes of the period, it appears that the exchange of the Greek Cyprus and the Turks of Western Thrace was on the agenda during the periods of conflict in Cyprus, since it was clear that these exchange discussions could not be implemented due to the Treaty of Lausanne. A second solution, the exchange of Istanbul Greeks and Western Turks, came to the agenda. It would not be correct to read this only as an anti-Greek issue, as the exchange of the Turkmens of Iraq and the Kurds of Turkish nationality living along the border was also discussed in the early 1960s. From this perspective, the 1964 deportations could be seen as a reflex in the post-population exchange Turkish society. And third, contrary to the popular belief, Cyprus has not always occupied Turkish public opinion, especially when it comes to the debates in the 1940s. Government officials refrained from getting involved in the Cyprus issue. However, when the Menderes government prepared for a pogrom in order to politicize the population and make government support visible, Cyprus created a fireball effect in Turkish public opinion. In 1960, during the negotiations for the establishment of the independent Republic of Cyprus, Turkey, Greece, and the UK were assigned as guarantor countries of Cyprus. In case of a possible problem, all three countries would act together and reach a compromise. However, after 1960 constitution was annulled by President of Cyprus, the intercommunal violence accelerated and the issue of Cyprus reappears in Turkish public opinion. The clashes that started on the evening of December 20, 1963, which is referred as the Bloody Christmas in Turkish historiography, especially in the areas where Turkish people lived in Nicosia, occupied a large place on the Turkish agenda. Putting the Cyprus issue aside, when the coalition governments established after the sixth coup failed, the third coalition government was formed under the leadership of İnönü on December 25, 1963. And this government was weak against opposition, which had remained silent for a short time after the execution of Menderes, but had millions of resentful people behind it. On the other hand, when we look at the letters sent to the prime minister of the time, I see that the number of those who want to go to Cyprus voluntarily and those who want to be a prime minister to take a tougher stance was quite high. Therefore, the government had to take a step to force Greece to sit at the bargaining table on Cyprus in foreign policy and to protect itself from both the opposition and angry voters in domestic politics. For this reason, the weak coalition government proposed the termination of the treaty about the residence, commerce, and navigation to the parliament, and as a result of the vote held in closed session on March 16, 1964, the agreement that allowed Greek citizens to live, trade, and travel in Turkey as Turkish citizens was unilaterally terminated. So, the question comes here. Who are these Greek citizens? One of the primary issues resolved during the Lausanne negotiation was the exchange of populations. Anatolian Greeks and Muslims living in Greece would be exchanged. However, the Greeks who settled in Istanbul before 1918 and the Muslim population living in Western Track were excluded from the population exchange. While the majority of the Greek population living in Istanbul were Ottoman citizens, the remaining 20% of, according to the 1927 census, by the way, the 20% were Greek citizens. This can be attributed to two reasons, actually. The families of the people I met in my interviews who were deported for being Greek citizens were mostly from Aegean Island and Epirus region, which were previously Ottoman territories but became Greek after the independence of the Greece. In the mid-19th century, poverty, especially in the newly established Greek kingdom, led to large and continuous migrations to Istanbul, which was the center of attraction and opportunity at the time. And the second reason, for trade opportunities, maybe some of the Greeks could have been changed their citizenships. The people that I encountered with my field research actually were the descendants of those who migrated to Istanbul from the former Ottoman lands and the new Greek kingdom in the mid-19th century. When the Turkish Republic was founded, those who were Ottoman citizens acquired Turkish citizenship. But the situation was different for Greek citizens. First, the Treaty of Lausanne, and then the aforementioned Treaty of 1930, the Friendship Treaty, prepared the legal ground for Greek citizens to stay in Turkey. One question that may come to mind here is why Greek citizens may have remained Greek citizens. When I ask my interviewees why their families didn't take Turkish citizenship, the answer I received often pointed to feudal values, actually. My father wanted to preserve his father's identity, for example. On the other hand, being a Turkish citizen meant being more vulnerable to the state. Being a Greek citizen offered relative protection against compulsory military service and various anti-minority policies. However, from the experience of the painter, Elif Kevser, it would not be too much of an exaggeration to say that the Turkish state has been reluctant to grant Turkish citizen too. Although Evie, a Greek citizen, is an artist representing Turkey in international organizations abroad, her application for Turkish citizenship had not received a positive response. For this reason, Evie was also deported. To summarize in one sentence, the Greek citizens who had to leave the country in 1964-1965 were the children and grandchildren of Greek passport holders who had settled Istanbul before 1918. And are there Greek citizens who are not deported? Yes, Catholic Greeks are not deported. Testimony of one of my interviewees on this issue is important. In the first weeks of October 1964, while they were waiting at the foreigners branch of the police headquarters in Sirkeci to carry out the deportation procedures of her father, a Catholic couple with Greek citizenship came to the security office and objected to the notification that they received, saying that the Monsignor said that Catholics would not be deported. A small argument ensues. After receiving the passports and documents, the policeman leaves to consult with his superior. When he returns, the couple is vindicated. The officer in charge says that they are right and returns the couple's passports. On the other hand, this practice towards Catholics may have taken time to become standardized. As one of my interviews told me that his uncle, who was Catholic, left Istanbul in the summer of 1964 when his passport expired, while his father was kept from deportation by bringing in well-connected acquaintances. It should be noted that in the time I was able to look at the records of the Deportees Association in Athens, I came across only one Catholic name, and that this name also left Istanbul in the summer of 1964. It is not possible to know the denomination of the deportees, but based on these testimonies, it is possible to conclude that the Orthodox Greek subjects were targeted. And why is the deportation of 1964 important? It is one of the anti-minority policies referred to in the existing literature as Turkification policies, in particular in the early Republican period, a series of practices aimed to Turkify the population. The deportation of 1964 may very well be counted among these practices, but it stands above the other policies because it legitimizes a second mass migration in post-population exchange Turkey. Apellasis'i ranks first among the reasons why the number of Istanbul Greeks is so low today. When it comes to Greek citizens deported from Turkey, two different groups can be mentioned. According to the articles of 1930 agreement, the citizens of other countries must leave the country that they live 6 months after the termination of the agreement. However, the Turkish government deported the Greek citizens on the grounds of crimes against the state, accusing them of espionage, aiding Cyprus, and carrying out harmful activities against Turkey. The first group of deportees are those who were accused of carrying out harmful activities within the first 6 months of the termination of the agreement and were immediately deported. The second group consists of persons who were deported within the period following the termination of the agreement because their residence permit in Turkey was not renewed. According to the terminated agreement, Greek citizens in Turkey are obliged to obtain a residence permit called as vesika, which you can see on the left. These permits are usually for 1 or 2 years. Within the termination of the agreement, thousands of Greek nationals' residence permits are not renewed. These people are informed by the police near the expiry date of their residence permits and are forced to leave the country. Some of them leave the country without waiting for this date. On the other hand, their spouses, children, and relatives who are Turkish citizens follow their deported family members and leave the country. Therefore, it is possible to think that approximately 40,000 Greeks left the country in 2 years, including the Turkish citizen Greeks accompanying the 12,000 Greek citizens in official figures. Turkey periodically often its deportations. During periods of heightened political tension, more Greeks are accused of harmful activities and deported. There was a noticeable increase in the number and frequency of deportations between June 1964 and the first week of August, when the fighting in Cyprus increased. What happened in June 1964 is that the US President Johnson wrote a strongly worded letter directly to Prime Minister İnönü after Turkey announced that it would attempt to land in Cyprus, in which he stated that NATO weapons could not be used against NATO allies, and which had a great impact on public opinion and put the coalition government of the time in a very difficult situation. The summer of 1964 was also a period when the Greeks who were not deported but frustrated by the political repression in the country and could not see a future for themselves in Turkey, left Turkey voluntarily. In addition, when we look at the newspaper archives, it is also possible to come across news articles, which the headlines, Greeks are leaving of their own accord. Thousands of Greeks left Istanbul, which talk about the mass migration of Greeks in the fall of 1964. The stories I encountered in my field research also confirm this. The deportation started in March 64 and continued until March 66, when an estimated 2-year residence permit expired. However, in the fall of 64, following criticisms in United Nations Parliamentary, the Turkish government relaxed the practice and announced that it would exclude the elderly over the age of 65, Greek nationals married to Turks, the ailing people, and students. By this date, however, the Greeks of Istanbul had already left Turkey. This process didn't stop in March 66. After this date, Greeks continued to leave Turkey with increasing intensity from time to time. Considering that Greeks were targeted in Cyprus tensions, the most intense period of Greek-Turkish citizens leaving Istanbul may have been the summer of 1974. And when we come to the event itself, according to the testimonies of my interviewees, a Greek citizen can learn about his or her deportation in 3 different ways. First, 2 police officers come directly to his or her home or workplace and hand deliver the notice of deportation. Second, she is informed through acquaintances before the notice arrives. And third, she learns about her deportation by seeing her name in the newspapers. In the normal procedure, the person who receives the notice of deportation is invited to the police headquarters in Sirkeci, directly to the political branch if she is accused of harmful activities, or to the foreigners branch if there is no such accusation. During the procedures there, the person to be deported is fingerprinted, photographed, measured for height, and subjected to a general medical examination. They are also made to sign a statement that they left the country of their own free will, stating that they directly violated the law on the protection of the Turkish currency, were a member of the organization called the Union of Hellenic Subjects of Constantinople, Ενική Constantinopolis, which was shut down for political activities against Turkey, and sent money to Greek terrorists in Cyprus, and that they left Turkey of their own free will. It quickly spread among the Greeks that those who refused to sign this statement were tortured. For this reason, in most of the testimonies I have encountered, I have heard that the deported Greeks signed these statements without any resistance. With this signed statement, the state legitimizes the accusations against the deportees on the document. On the other hand, I also heard in some testimonies that these people were made to deal with various reasons during the procedures at the police station. One interviewee mentioned that her elderly father was made to go back and forth between floors for lack of documents or stamps. They were made to wait arbitrarily at the police station and were subjected to various humiliations and embarrassments. Most of my interviewers mentioned that they felt very uneasy at the police station. Another thing that was particularly remembered about the police headquarters in Sirkeci was the sounds coming from the torture chambers on the top floor of the building. The feeling that something could happen to us at any moment was frequently mentioned in the interviews. Again, according to the testimonies I encountered in my field research, some Greek nationals, after learning that they would be deported, applied for citizenship because they didn't want to leave Istanbul. Some wanted to marry and convert to Turkish nationality. Some tried to have this decision annulled through petitions, as you can see in this page, and the solicitation or bribery of various acquaintances. However, I came across only one story of someone who succeeded. One interviewer told me that an influential Greek from his family was not deported in exchange for huge amounts in bribes. There were also economic sanctions against those who were deported, based on a secret decree signed by then President Cemal Gürsel. The assets of Greek nationals were confiscated. They are allowed to take with them foreign currency equivalent to $20 and 20 kilos of worthless daily personal belongings, such as clothes, a set of forks, spoon, knives, a water glass, a pair of shoes. And those who are not accused of harmful activities but are expelled because their documents are expired are allowed to ship their belongings. Items to be shipped by train from Sirkeci are also recorded in passports. Months later, if they were lucky, they were able to receive their belongings in Athens. But the aforementioned İvis Stangali, who was Bedri Rahmi Eyüboğlu's assistant and had been involved in many international projects, had her entire portfolio shipped to Sirkeci until she was deported, but unfortunately didn't receive it in Athens. She didn't receive a reply to her repeated letters of complaint and help. While Ivy was a famous painter when she left Istanbul, in Athens she became someone who couldn't prove herself as a painter. In the first period, deportees are deported in a very short period of time, perhaps before they have time to say goodbye to their relatives under police escort. In the following weeks of the implementation, deportees are given a 1-week grace period. These relatively lucky deportees go to the consulate after the police. The consulate organizes daily, weekly flights for the deportees in agreement with Olympic Air and provides tickets to the deportees to be used on these flights. On the other hand, the deportees ask the consulate to deliver some of their personal belongings in a diplomatic suitcase to them in Athens. The consulate receives these items, and if the owners can be found at the address they did provide, they are delivered to them. However, one of my interviewees, Savas, mentioned that his father Dimitri's stamp collection was lost at the consulate. On the other hand, in another testimony that may be related to this narrative of lost items, another interviewee mentioned that years later, he stumbled upon an archive in Istanbul where he saw boxes full of personal belongings. These items included glasses, watch, wedding rings, fountain pens, stock certificates dating back to the Ottoman Empire, and jewelry that deportees left behind at the consulate. On the other hand, in case of tax evasion, Greek nationals' homes and goods in their workplaces are confiscated by the finance authorities. Taxation is calculated at a higher value, similar to previous years. In addition to the seizure of bank accounts, household goods and the personal belongings are confiscated to be fortified to the treasury if taxes are not paid. For example, Dimitra explained that after her father's deportation, officials from the Ministry of Finance came to the house and listed all the belongings. Only one item, the sewing machine that her father had bought for Dimitra, was not included in the list because Dimitra's name was written on the receipt for the machine. Irene told a different story about her neighbors who were deported. When the finance officer came to the house, their neighbor, Kyria Eleni, who was very upset, started to cry. Seeing her crying in distraught state, the officer said, "I am leaving now. I will come back in the afternoon. Put away the things you don't want me to include in the list until I come back." So Irene's mother and Kyria Eleni hid some small items on the ground floor of the building. Statis has to take over all his father's work when his father is deported. Statis remembers that even the machines brought for repair in his father's shop were registered by the finance officers. Despite this, he explains that he took the risk and delivered all the machines brought to his shop for repair to their owners before leaving Istanbul, so that no one would be victimized. Akis, on the other hand, remembers how the furniture in his parents' house was plundered by their neighbors. "This table is going to be bought anyway. We might as well as replace it with ours." Akis finds the rocking chair, the only item from his childhood that is still in his home in Athens today, in the house of a neighbor and takes it back by force. Eleftheriphoni reported that items were being sold for much less than their value and that opportunists were taking advantage of plight of people who were about to be deported. On the other hand, the victimization here should not distract us from the fact that the Greeks of Istanbul are actors seeking solutions for themselves in difficult situations. For example, Statis' uncle sells his small plot of land on the Principal shortly before the land registry regulation preventing the sale of assets. The police, who knew about the sale, pressured his uncle to deposit the money in the bank. Realizing that he couldn't get the money out through official means because he was a Greek citizen, he swam across the Meriç River and fled to Greece with the money. When we look at the newspapers of the period, we see that the deportation news is dominated by a discourse that criminalizes the Greeks of Istanbul. The newspapers often report on the people accused of human tax and foreign currency smuggling. Human trafficking can be seen as a solution for people trying to leave Turkey via Meriç or Syria, as in the example I mentioned earlier. On the other hand, my interviewee Vasilis shared with me a narrative that could serve as an example of accusations of tax evasion in the news. His father is a Greek citizen who runs one of the well-known beaches in Istanbul. He also pays his taxes regularly. However, during the taxation practices that started after the termination of the agreement, a policeman friend of his father warned him that he would owe a large tax debt. Statis' father then leaves Istanbul in one night. I can also tell a story about currency smuggling. In a news article I stumbled upon in the newspaper archive, a Greek woman named Erifili, you can see on the right in this page. Erifili actually was accused of smuggling money in Turkish delight boxes at the border. I realized that this person, whose full name was given in the news article, and an interviewee I made during my field research, had the same last name, and I called my interviewee and asked him about this name. My interviewee told me that Erifili was his aunt, who was caught at the border, wanted to send money to her son studying in Athens, but she couldn't do so due to the current economic pressure, and that she finally found such a solution. On the other hand, some of the people in the news as foreign currency smugglers are the brokers that some of the interviews remembered as intermediaries for money trafficking. These people have offices in Sirkeci and say that they will pick up the money of people leaving Istanbul and deliver it to Greece in exchange for certain commission. I have heard of people who have been defrauded, as well as those who have been able to get their money out of the country in this way. On the other hand, the process of announcing the list of those to be deported was also very tiresome. For days, weeks, and months, the Greeks of Istanbul would search for their names and the names of their relatives in the newspapers. They live with the possibility of being deported at any moment and live with a prolonged psychological pressure. So much so that in the summer of 1964, when Dora saw her father coming home with a newspaper on the street of their house, calling Kalipatrida, and finally learned that he had been deported, her first reaction to this news was, thank God. Now the uncertainty and the months of anxiety are over. Her father will be deported and the family will leave Istanbul. Even this is better than months of waiting on pins and needles. On the other hand, Dimitri's family can't stand the uncertainty. The whole family are Greek subjects. They will have to leave sooner or later. So When the Turkish government imposed economic sanctions, the family decided to leave Istanbul in May 1964. Dimitri's father, Niko, the owner of one of Istanbul's biggest department stores, secretly sells all his goods to a neighbor for a fraction of their value. However, when someone finds out about this, he reports Niko to the police. Niko bribes the police officers who come to his store and ask to delay deadline. The family then leaves Istanbul in the middle of the night before they have a chance to prepare. Dimitris arrives in Athens via Thessaloniki with his mother, while Niko and his elder son reaches Lebanon via Syria and from Lebanon to Athens. All this effort was to take the money from the store's merchandise with them to Athens. Finally, Niko bought a second-hand car with this money. And with this old car, he started trading from scratch, selling fabrics in the villages of Athens. Among those deported, the ones with a relative advantage are those whose spouses and children are Turkish citizens. Turkish citizens can take $200 with them. The deportees were allowed to take just $20. As the Turkish citizens can go abroad with tourist currency. They can also sell their real estate and take their household goods with them. For example, Prodromos, who followed his deported father to Athens, recalls that he was able to take $200 with him because he was a Turkish citizen, and that a truck loaded with the belongings of Turkish citizens accompanied them on the bus to Athens. In the narratives of leaving Istanbul, customs becomes an area of vulnerability. Evi, who had to leave Istanbul after her father was deported, is subjected to strip searches at the airport. Hasalis, who was deported as soon as he turned 18, has a different testimony of customs. Upon his mother's request, he takes his grandmother's set of 12 dinner plates. This was the only item he could take with him from home. However, when the officers searching the train see the plates, they say these plates are antiques, historical artifacts, and want to take them. Then they take the Turkish Cypriot family traveling with Passalis to England from Istanbul out of the compartment and tell them that they will ignore these plates on one condition. Passalis, who gave half of the 200 liras he had with him to these officers, got a second shock at customs. This time he was charged 100 liras custom-free for the plates. When Passalis arrives in Athens, his mother is very upset to hear that he spent all the money he had with him for plates. The most difficult part of the interviews was the narration of the first days of life in Athens. Poverty, destitution, loneliness, lack of support, longing for Istanbul, and hopelessness were the common themes of the testimonies. The vast majority of my interviewees have no relatives in Athens, considering that the majority of those deported were middle-aged and therefore affected by the wealth tax, the Septembriana. Their attempt to establish a life in a foreign land after leaving Istanbul is, in the simplest term, is an experience of moving drastically down the social ladder and the struggle to start from scratch. After staying in a hotel for a while with the $20 cash they can bring with them and looking for a job, a few families get together at the first opportunity and rent cheap apartments. Sorry. Vasilis, for example, had a hard time in our interview describing how, after spending a few nights on chairs in what is Sukar, where they got off the bus in the first days of their arrival in Athens. After then, they met some acquaintances, and together with them, they rented a small one-room apartment in which it was almost impossible to stand because of the heat from the bread bakery downstairs, and how the three deported families tried to live. Similarly, Prissy talked about how after staying in a hotel for the first few days in their arrival in Athens, her father had to take the first job he could find. Her 60-year-old father, who owned a mechanic shop in Istanbul, attempted suicide in the port of Piraeus on his way back from the work shortly after he started working as a car washer in Skaramaga, a port town far from Athens, and was rescued by the guards. I often came across relatives who had committed suicide, especially in the early days of deportation. Premature deaths in families, heart disease, and cancer were always explained as a result of deportation and the hardships suffered in Athens. Those who had relatives in Athens tried to end their forced stay as soon as possible and started working in the first jobs they came across. While other Greeks were unable to find work, family members, especially the mothers of the families who had not worked in Istanbul, began to work in Athens. These jobs, maids, nursing, tailors, apprenticeship, unskilled factory labor, are unregistered, based on physical labor, and precarious. In addition to physical exhaustion, it is also psychologically exhausting for women whose access to the outside world is limited due to the fatal values. Some of my interviewees mentioned that their mothers, aunts, had to work secretly from neighbors, relatives, and even their husbands for fear of being shamed, and then they suffered from certain disease, tuberculosis, for example, for the rest of their lives due to these jobs. I also heard from my interviews that after they came to Athens, they had to work while they continued their education and had to pay for their own expenses with small incomes, and they tried to finish their school ahead of time. Some of my interviews stated that when the Greeks of Istanbul arrived in Athens, they found jobs easily because they were more educated than the locals. But these people remained in the minority. Especially Plateavatis, which is the last stop of the Istanbul buses in Athens, is primarily a place frequented by the Greeks of Istanbul who are waiting for or looking for their relatives, while the square turns into a meeting point with the cafe opened by Greeks of Istanbul on the edge of the square. While waiting for the buses coming from Istanbul, the Greeks from Istanbul would listen to Zeki Müren or Kazancadis while reminiscing about those they had left behind. In time, with the increase in job seekers, the square acquires a new function. Construction foremen looking for daily laborers hire cheap workers from here. The construction sector, which had risen rapidly with the aid received in Athens to erase the traces of the occupation and the ensuing war, opened a different door for the Greeks of Istanbul who had to find work in a short time. Carpenters and electricians who owned shops in Istanbul began to work as a craftsman in construction, while those without experience in this field began to earn daily wages in daily construction work that required relatively little experience. Considering the age range of my interviewees, it is possible to talk about peer bullying. Some of my interviewees told me that they were ostracized by their classmates in the first years of their settlement in Athens, and that they were insulted because they were from Istanbul. However, I see this issue of otherization is the effect of the existing tendency to make what is happening worse than it is, and thus to serve to make what is happening more audible. In addition, this situation can also be read as the effect of the lens through which the researchers look at their work. To give an example, during the interviews, in response to the question, what were the difficulties you had here, it is possible to hear the answer that they called us Turkosforos. However, when the question from whom did you receive support was asked immediately afterwards, I received answers, my neighborhood friends loved me very much, or a local Greek acquaintance gave me a scholarship, or we had an Egyptian neighbor who took care of my siblings. The effort to show the victimization experience in the establishment of this, let's say, mythos is to the extent that it also directs the narratives. The narrative of otherization takes precedence over the support scene. This situation is not noticed unless it is asked in the interviews. Moreover, the fact that Greeks from Istanbul received support in Athens doesn't mean that they didn't have difficulties. On the contrary, the fact that they didn't remember this despite receiving support indicates that the baggage of the difficulties they suffered was heavier. Although Greek government didn't directly develop a special policy for Greek citizens from Istanbul, it soon expanded the scope of the facilities it provided to Greek citizens from Egypt who left Egypt and settled in Greece due to the Nasser regime policies of nationalizing the economy, and started to provide some facilities to the Greeks from Istanbul, such as military service for free, paid military service, receiving aid in kind for a year, counting the days worked in Turkey for retirement, and being able to enter university without exams. However, Greek governments changed constantly during this period. There were no permanent, stable, and systematic practices. We do not know how much of this support was available, especially to those who were older and had difficulties interacting with the Greek state. It can be assumed that people with a relative network who were able to follow what is happening around them and defend their rights are more likely to access these supports. For example, an elderly person coming to Athens from Istanbul needs a witness to be able to retire. If this witness says that the person in question worked for him or her in Istanbul and submits this statement with a petition to the Social Security Directorate, the person is able to receive pension. One of my family interviews, this is important because she uses a different surname than her father, made a similar testimony for her father. She said that her father was her driver in Istanbul and this helped her father to retire. So, while some of my interviewees spoke very matter-of-factly about the help they received, others were quite angry with the Greek government. You could still hear their resentment when they said that they hadn't received any help at all. Therefore, I can say that the assertion that Greece didn't help the Greeks of Istanbul is questionable with the stories I encountered in my field research. Yet, there is a particular vulnerability in the new life in Athens for Greeks who are Turkish citizens and who left Turkey with their deported relatives. Since they were not legally deported and in theory left Turkey voluntarily, they do not have the same rights as Greek citizens. They need to obtain work and residence permits. Bureaucratic obstacles were frequently mentioned in my field research. However, some people lost their Turkish citizenship as a result of resentment and uneasiness towards Turkey and not going to the consulate. In particular, men who were Turkish citizens, even though they were not deported, could not come to Turkey for a long time because of not having done their military service. They couldn't take action regarding their properties left in Istanbul. The children of some of them, born in Greece, have until recently been living as haymatlos, stateless. They have had to live with semi-official identity cards issued by Greek authorities stating that they are originally Turkish citizens, but not verified by any Turkish authority, and valid only in Greece. Therefore, it is possible to say that the vulnerability, the precarity of the displaced Istanbul Greeks has been passed on to the next generation. On the other hand, when some of my interviews arrived in Athens, they were supported by their relatives who had left Istanbul due to the population exchange and or the anti-minority policies of the Republican period. Some of them stay in the homes of these relatives who arrived in Athens earlier, and some of them are able to find jobs relatively faster through these relatives. In addition to relatives, other support mechanisms are also developed during this period. In 1965, the Association of Exiles was founded in Athens with the support of recently deported Greek citizens under the leadership of the members of Ethniki Enosis Association, who were deported from Turkey in 1958. And when the membership registration forms of the association that you can see in this slide, which is still active today, I mean the association is still active today. And when we examine these registration forms, the fact that some of the members state their current occupation as ırgatis cannot provide a valid work address and are not registered with a social security institution indicates that they mostly work in unskilled, temporary, and precarious jobs that require physical labor. On the other hand, the fact that the number of those who registered in 1965, when the association was founded, decreased rapidly in the following years suggests that the association was seen as a means of seeking rights and support to solve acute problems by deportees when it was first established. The association statute states that the purpose of the association is to support members in need financially and morally, and to have a strong presence in negotiation for state aid and compensation for property left in Turkey. In addition to this association, the Association of Students from Istanbul, Fitediki Enosi Kostantinopolis, FEK, also appears as an organized support mechanism. The founding purpose of the association is given as ensuring solidarity among university students from Istanbul and producing resources and organizing activities for the needs of students. FEK generates income for the association by organizing paid dinner nights with various student groups, especially during Christmas time. And with this income, it creates a common library and continues its activities for many years by organizing various events among young people. There are also similar associations in Thessaloniki, but in the sake of time management, I will not be able to mention them separately. Another support mechanism that I cannot fail to mention here is the newspaper Opolitis. Opolitis, whose founder was also a deported Greek, was initially published as small pamphlets providing information on legal issues such as state aid and the application for military service, as well as job advertisements, but in time it became a newspaper for polites living in Athens. I scanned all the issues of Opolitis between the years 67-72, and as an example, here we see the number November 1967 issue of Politis. On the first page, there is news about Greece, generally. On the page 4, the latest developments, international developments. For example, for this issue, there was news about Cyprus. And the most interesting page for me in the newspaper is page 2, where the announcement of the new shops of the Politis in Athens and news about the members of the community from Istanbul are given. You can see the page 2 on your right. In the detail photo on the right, that the shops here are listed with their addresses in Athens and their former addresses in Istanbul. There is also an advertisement for private tutoring by a Robert College graduate. On the right is the news from Istanbul, Mikranea Papali, which includes news such as who died in Istanbul, whose children got married, who had their children baptized. Over time, as more and more people come from Istanbul, the advertisement page expands. Some of my interviewers shared with me their experiences of living in Istanbul by placing the deportation at the center of their lives. Time was two-way and one-dimensional in these narratives. Before Istanbul and after Istanbul. Living in Istanbul had created a major break in time. Time had frozen, life had never flowed the same after leaving Istanbul. I don't know if it was Istanbul that was missed, the childhood years, or an imagined nostalgia for happiness. On the other hand, for some of my interviewees, it was a good thing that the Greeks of Istanbul were deported. What would have happened if they stayed in Istanbul? Would they have spent their lives in fear? For others, life was like this. Istanbul was abandoned, but for better or worse, life went on. Tapanda rain. In order to understand these different interpretations, I had to compare the stories of my interviewees. In order to do so, I looked at the nature of the damage caused by deportation, the extent of this damage or adversity, the class of dimension of the adversity, the character structure of the person who suffered the adversity, her ability to integrate available support mechanisms, whether he or she had hope for the future, and the gender dimension. When I evaluated each story in its specific circumstances, I reached roughly the following conclusion. Young, middle-aged, middle-class men with some kind of talent, playing sports, singing, fluent in foreign language, were able to adapt more quickly when they arrived in Athens. Talent makes it easier to be recognized and can become a tool for inclusion in different groups. For example, Dimitri, who worked as a muganni, a church singer in Istanbul, is bullied by his peers at his new school. One day, during break time, he starts to sing a well-known hymn, and it is noticed that he has a beautiful voice. The children who bullied him are also mugannis in another church and invite Dimitri to sing with them. On the other hand, in my field research, I often heard that older people never got used to Athens. When I asked my interviews, who were between the ages of 10 and 25 when they were deported, how did you feel? I often heard we didn't realize it, or we were excited to go somewhere else. For all my interviewees, living in Istanbul was a difficult experience, but trying to make a life in Athens was not as severely traumatizing as it was for older people. In terms of the quality and quantity of the adversity, it can be said that the middle class suffered relatively less loss. Being deported meant that the vulnerability experienced in Istanbul was exacerbated. Everyone in these stories I heard in my field research, without exception, had been socially and financially demoted after leaving Istanbul. The upper classes who owned real estate in Istanbul had lost all their assets. Perhaps their heirs may have partially recovered these losses in the following years. Those who didn't own real estate lost relatively less. The middle class, on the other hand, tried to bring their savings back to Athens, albeit partially, through various means. I often heard that the poor and had more difficult in Athens. One explanation for this could be that when they go to Athens, they lack the support mechanisms they had in Istanbul. Solidarity, eating together, living together, borrowing money, for example. Finally, I would like to talk about the women's experiences in Athens. The first days are very difficult for all interviewees without exception. However, for the young women, the safe environment in Athens and Thessaloniki created freedom and excitement for their new life. New experiences, such as feeling safe in Athens in public spaces, being able to exist in public spaces without fear of being harassed, and being able to claim their rights in case of injustice, were mentioned as liberating and exciting experiences, especially for women who were high school and university age at the time of deportation. However, the situation must be different for older women, as it would not be out of place to think that they are left alone at home in a foreign place outside their own networks, unlike those who go to school or work. And if they are working, they become even more vulnerable through physical labor. The arrival of acquaintances, friends, and relatives from Istanbul over time may have provided a breathing space to regain access to lost social support networks. In closing, it is possible to say that my interviewees' connection with Istanbul continues today. They continue to be polytheists by producing in various fields, composing about Istanbul, publishing research on the history of Istanbul, taking part in volunteer work for Greek Istanbul, for polytheists, sewing puppets, babies that portray life in Istanbul, recording examples of civilian buildings on the islands, let's say, organizing the restoration of Greek cemeteries in Istanbul. As one of my interviews wrote on the first page of his book that he gave me as a gift, polytheists don't want to be forgotten because there are so few of them left. The story of the extinction of polytheists is also a story of resilience. The Greeks of Istanbul endured these hardships, regenerated. They established families and continued with their lives. This part of the story should not be forgotten. They expanded their experiences of living, being, and witnessing. Thank you for your attention. You may see my email address at the bottom of the video. So if you would like to contact me, please feel free. Thank you.